Hi Essex, it's Miss Ad here with another reading lesson. This week in reading we are going to continue with The Explorer. As you know, we did do it last week, but we are continuing on with it. We are reading further now, we're going on to chapter 3 and I can't wait to start reading it with you all. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. The Explorer, we already know what's happening. We know that there's 4 children, they're on a plane on their way to Manaus and the plane suddenly crashes. We need to find out if the pilot is alive still, so we might have to continue reading to find that out. We're going to start this week with our vocabulary. As we always do, I'm going to have my turn and then you're going to repeat after me. So please make sure you are listening carefully. So, sodden. And this is an adjective and it means something that's saturated with liquid, especially water. Almost you could see it soaking through. In a sentence, we could say, after she came back from jumping in puddles, her clothes were sodden, which means soaking wet. Sodden. We then have another adjective, and this is accustomed. Accustomed. And this means to become used to. For example, in a sentence, you could say, as she moved countries, she became accustomed to the rules. Accustomed. Our next word, which is now a verb, is scrambled. And this means to make one's way up quickly or awkwardly up a steep gradient or over a rough ground. So for example, in a sentence you could say, during her daily walks, she scrambled up the steep hillside over the rocks to watch the beautiful view. Scrambled. We then have an adjective, which is unbearable. And this means to not be able to endure or tolerate something. So, for example, this might be weather. In a sentence, you could say, during July, the heat in Dubai is unbearable. They can't take it. It's too hot. We have a verb, which is clustered. And this is to be grouped together, almost describing a bunch of people here. So, in a sentence, you could say, the students clustered round the guest speaker to hear his story. Clustered. Then have a verb, which is entwined. Entwined. And this is wind or twist together, interweave. So, for example, in a sentence, we could say, the roses entwine the little cottage, which means they interweaved round the little cottage. Almost sometimes when you walk past some houses, you can see flowers or plants entwined together around the houses, growing around the home. We then have another verb, which is convulse. And this means to shake violently or uncontrollably. So, in a sentence, I have written, a racking cough convulsed her whole body, which means this cough was really bad, making her whole body shake. We're going to have another verb, which is barely. And this means hardly or scarcely. So you could say there was barely any food left in the fridge. This meant we had to go shopping. Barely. Then we have an adjective, which is bitter. And this means feeling or showing anger, hurt or resentment because of a bad experience. So you could say he was feeling bitter towards his friend as he didn't share any of his sweets. Bitter. And then yours. Sodden. Accustomed. Scrambled. Unbearable. Oh, I can't hear you. Let's say that louder. Clustered. Intertwined. Convulse. Barely. Bitter. Before you start your activity, you need a pen and a ruler and a copy of your activity. If you're writing out the sentences, please make sure you write out the sentences fully. So let's start. So I need to finish the sentences, and this is my vocabulary activity. So firstly, my first sentences, Joss felt uncomfortably full as he was not accustomed. Well, I know from my vocabulary, accustomed means become used to. So I need to find a sentence which will link to become used to a set of rules, for example. So Joss felt uncomfortably full as he was not used to. And I think the sentence that will best match with that is to eating too much. So I'm going to read the sentence out to myself. Joss felt uncomfortably full as he was not accustomed to eating so much. He was not used to eating so much, and that is why he felt so full. I'd like you to pause the video now and have a go at the activity. Not continue following the video unless you have finished. Show yourself that integrity and honesty to mark your work until you have finished. So I'm going to give you the answers now together, and please check along with your work. Remember to tick your answers if they're correct, and if it's not, please go back in and correct your mistakes. We love learning from our mistakes. That's why it's great making them. So our next sentence is, they had silk ribbons and flowers entwined, which means interweave. It's twisted almost, entwined. And I need to find a sentence that matches through that. Well, I know that actually entwined here has been repeated, so we're going to cross that out. So it should be, they had silk ribbons and flowers entwined in their hair, which means in their hair they had silk ribbons and flowers which was threaded through their hair. So I'm going to match that with my sentence. We then have another sentence, which is, before collapsing on the ground, the ill woman began to convulse. Well, I know convulse means to shake violently or uncomfortably, so I have to look for a sentence that matches with that. So, before collapsing on the ground, the ill woman began to convulse. I need to find something that matches that. Well, I've looked at my definition and it actually fits here. Convulse and shake violently, which means because of her, because she was ill, she wasn't feeling well, she was violently shaking on the ground. You need to match that with that sentence here. Remember, Miss Ahad's using a ruler, so you must also use your ruler. This way your presentation stays neat throughout. To see the view, you have to scramble. Well, scramble, I know, it means to make one's way quickly or awkwardly up a steep gradient or over rough ground. You're usually using your hands and feet to do that. Well, I need to look for my sentence that will work with that. Okay, so to see the view, you have to scramble. Oh, and I know that will fit in with over a sand dune, but it's worth the effort. This means you have to really go quickly over a sand dune to look at the view, but it's worth it in the end. We then have, the heat was becoming unbearable. They couldn't deal with the heat. So I decided, well, I know when the heat's unbearable, usually when I'm on the beach, I like to go and sit in the shade. So that will fit in with this sentence up here. So the heat was becoming unbearable, so I decided to sit in the shade, away from the sun. We then have, a group of people were clustered. Well, this I know means gathered together or grouped together. So I'm going to look for a sentence that will fit around here. A group of people were clustered around a hot dog van parked at the curb. More than a whisper. With the rain. Well, I know these two sentences, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in with this sentence. So I know a group of people were clustered will fit in with round a hot dog van parked at the curb. This suggesting to me they were clustered round, so gathered around the hot dog van because they wanted the hot dog. So I'm going to match those two together, again using my ruler to keep my presentation nice and neat. If you're writing it out, please write out your full sentences. His grey jumper and trousers were sodden. Well, sodden means to be soaked through, and usually with water. So his grey jumper and trousers were sodden with rain, because I know rain makes your clothes wet, especially when it's heavy rain, and it makes it soaks through, so therefore those two will match together. And lastly, I have, the leader spoke so quietly, his voice was barely, which means rarely or scarcely, couldn't really hear it. So the leader spoke so quietly, his voice was barely more than a whisper, suggesting to me he was talking very quietly. Now, please mark your activity. And we're going to go on to reading now. So please take out a copy of the text. If you have it on your screen, absolutely fine. If you've printed it out, please follow along with Miss Ahad. It was a girl's voice. Remember here, we just remember that Fred has landed somewhere, and after the aeroplane crashed, and he's heard a sudden voice and he's quite frightened. So now he's found out it's actually a girl's voice. Fred looked out from behind the tree. The light of the moon filtered deep green to the forest floor, casting long-fingered shadows against the tree, and he could see two bushes, both of them rustling, which means both of them moving. Who is it? Who's there? The voice came from the second bush. Fred squinted again. That was from our vocabulary from yesterday. Pause the video and see if you can remember. Squinted means to look partly closed at something, especially when you're having difficulty looking from afar, or it could be closely that you're having difficulty. So you usually squint, you're partly closing your eyes to look at what you need to. If Fred squinted through the dark, feeling the remaining hair rise up on his arms. Remember, his hairs on his arms were singed and charred, suggesting they were burnt. So the language here suggests that it's the leftover hairs on his arms. Please don't hurt us, said the bush. The accent wasn't British. It was something softer, and the voice was definitely a child, not an adult. Was it you throwing poo? Fred looked down at the ground. He snatched up a piece of years-old fossilized animal dung. This suggests to me fossilized old animal poo. Oh, he said, yes. He was becoming accustomed. Oh, this is a word from our new vocabulary for this week. Well, accustomed, I want you to pause the video and see if you remember. Accustomed means to become used to. So in this sentence here, it means he is becoming used to the dark. He was becoming accustomed to the dark and could see the shine of eyes peering out from the grey-green gloom of the undergrowth. Are you from the plane? Are you hurt? Yes, we are hurt. We fell out of the sky, said one bush, as the other said, no, not badly. You can come out, said Fred. It's only me here. The second bush parted. Fred's heart gave a great leap. Both the girl and her brother were covered in scratches and burns and ash, which had mixed with sweat and rain and made a kind of paste on their faces, but they were alive. He was not alone. You survived, he said, again suggesting they survived from that crash on the airplane. Obviously we did, said the first bush, or we'd be less talkative, wouldn't we? The blonde girl stepped out into the lashing rain, suggesting here that the rain is pouring rain, it's heavily raining. She stared from Fred to the other two, unsmiling. I'm Con, she said. It's short for Constantia. But if you call me that, I'll kill you. Fred glanced at the other girl. She smiled nervously and shrugged. Right, he said. If you say so. I'm Fred. I'm Lila, said the second girl. She held her brother on her hip. And this is Max. Hi. Fred tried to smile, but it made the cuts on his cheek stretch and burn, so he stopped and made do with a grin that involved only the left of his face. Max was at the breathless stage of crying, and he clung to his sister so tightly his fingers were pressing bruises on her skin. She was leaning over to one side to hold him up, shaking with the effort. They looked. Fred thought, like two-headed creature, arms entwined. Again, this suggesting to me the language that they had interweaved in there, so their arms were twisted together. Is your brother badly hurt? He asked. Lila patted her brother desperately on the back. He won't talk. He's just crying. Con looked back towards the fire and shivered. The flames cast a light on her face. She was no longer blonde. Her hair was grey with soot and brown with blood, and she had a scratch on her shoulder that looked deep. Are you all right? He asked, wiping the rain out of his eyes. That cut looks bad. No, I'm not all right. Con spat. We are lost in the Amazon jungle. Oh, so they've told us where they are in the Amazon jungle. But I think before even getting to there, the setting description to me was suggesting that they were somewhere in the Amazon. And statistically speaking, it's very likely that we are going to die. I know. Fred didn't feel he needed reminding. I meant... So no. Con's voice grew thin and high. I think it would be safe to say that none of us are all right. Not at all. Not even slightly. The bushes rustled. The rain hammered down on Fred's face. Again, language suggested me it's pouring with rain. We need to find shelter, he said. A big tree or cave or something that would... No! Max gave a sudden scream, a yell that was wet with spit and fear. Fred stepped backwards, raising his hands. Don't cry, I just thought. Then his eyes followed Max's pointing finger. There, 3 inches from Fred's shoe, was a snake. It was speckled brown and black patchwork to match the jungle floor, and its head was big as a fist. Oh, speckled brown and black. This is describing the features of how the snake looks. For 1 second, nobody breathed. The jungle waited. Then Max let out a second scream that dug deep into the night, and the 4 of them turned and fled, which means they ran off. The ground was sodden. Oh, that's another key word. This suggests that the ground was soaking wet. and they ran pell-mell. This suggests that they were running really fast, quite scared whilst they were running, sending up mud into one another's eyes and grazing their elbows against a tree. Grazing, which also is another synonym for scratching. Fred ran as if his body were not his own, faster than he'd ever run, his palms stretched ahead of him. He tripped over a root and turned a full somersault, which is also roly-poly, coming up, spitting earth. He ran on. The rain blinded him and shadows flashed past him in the darkness. There was a yell behind him. "Please, Max," said Lila. Fred turned back, skidding in the mud. "He won't run." Lila bent over her brother. "And I can't carry him." The little boy lay on his back, weeping at the sky, his whole body shaking in the driving rain. "Come on!" Fred heaved Max over his shoulder, which means put Max over his shoulder. The boy was far heavier than he'd expected, and he screamed as Fred lifted him. But Fred grabbed both of Max's knees and started running, his whole body screaming with pain. He could hear Lila, her feet thumping close behind them. The stitch in Fred's side was almost unbearable. Again, this means he couldn't take it. It was very painful. When he tore out of the trees and into a sudden clearing, he halted, and Max bumped his head against Fred's spine and yelled angrily. He began trying to bite one of Fred's shoulder blades. "Please don't," said Fred. He was barely paying attention to the boy on his back. Barely, which means he wasn't really giving the boy any attention. He stared, stunned, ahead of him. They were standing at the edge of a wide circle of trees open to the sky and lit by a fat moon. There was a carpet of green moss and grass, and the stars above them were clustered so thickly that the silver outnumbered the night. Clustered is another one of our key words for this week. This means to be bunched together or gathered together. Fred lowered Max to the ground and stood bent over, his hands on his thighs, panting. "Did the snakes chase us?" said Max. "No," gasped Con. "How do you know that?" wailed Max. Lila dropped to her knees, clutching at her side. "Snakes don't. Maxie, we both know that. I just..." "Panic," said Con. Her voice was bitter. "That's what happened. See, look, no snakes. We were stupid. Now we're even more lost." The ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over it, his muscles aching, and sniffed. It smelled of rotting things, but he was feverishly thirsty. The language here, feverishly thirsty, suggests that Fred is coming up with a fever. Now, Year 6, I'd like you to read the text by yourself. I know we read it together once. I'd like you to have your turn and read it by yourself. Please feel free to upload your reading onto Seesaw. I'd love to have a look at you reading. Also, before you submit your vocabulary worksheet, please make sure you mark along and then upload a picture onto Seesaw. Your teachers would love to see your great marking, so please continue with that. Bye for now.